Michael stared at the empty dining table, his hands gripping a cold mug of coffee. The room was eerily quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the corner. He used to love this time of the evening, the moments after dinner when his daughter, Emma, would sit across from him, talking about her plans, her dreams, and the endless list of books she wanted to read. But that was a decade ago. 10 long years had passed since Emma vanished. She had been 22, full of life and ambition, about to graduate with honors from college. Michael could still see her beaming smile the last time he saw her. It was a bright spring morning, and she was packing her bags for a road trip with friends. "I'll call you when we get there, Dad. Don't worry," she had said, leaning in to kiss his cheek. Her laughter echoed through the house as she waved goodbye, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. But the call never came. The days that followed were a blur of panic, phone calls, and sleepless nights. The police investigation led nowhere. Her friends claimed they had dropped her off at a small roadside inn, but from there, Emma had disappeared without a trace. No witnesses, no evidence, just an empty room and her suitcase left behind. Michael's life unraveled after that. He quit his job, unable to focus. His wife, Lauren, left shortly after, unable to cope with the loss. Now, at 58, Michael lived alone in a house that felt more like a mausoleum of memories. Emma's room remained untouched, her books neatly arranged on the shelves, her graduation gown still hanging in the closet. He couldn't bring himself to move anything, as if holding on to these fragments of her life might somehow bring her back. Tonight, the weight of the silence felt suffocating. Michael pushed his chair back and grabbed his coat. The house seemed to shrink around him, and he needed air. Stepping outside, he was greeted by the crisp evening breeze. The streets were quiet, the distant sound of traffic the only sign of life. He wandered aimlessly, his feet leading him toward the small shopping district where Emma had once loved to browse bookstores and cafes. A shoe store caught his eye. Its warm, inviting light spilled onto the sidewalk, drawing him in. Michael hadn't planned on buying anything, but something about the cozy atmosphere made him pause. The faint smell of leather and polish greeted him as he pushed the door open. The store was quaint, with wooden shelves lined with neatly arranged shoes and soft jazz playing in the background. "Good evening, sir. Can I help you find something?" a young woman asked from behind the counter. Her voice was soft, polite, but what struck Michael was her face. She couldn't have been more than 32, with sharp features and piercing green eyes. There was something familiar in her expression, a subtle tilt of her head that made his chest tighten. "No, thank you. I'm just looking," Michael replied, trying to steady his voice. He moved through the store, his gaze drifting to the woman every so often. There was an inexplicable pull, an ache in his chest that he couldn't ignore. As he pretended to examine a pair of boots, he noticed a bracelet on her wrist. It was simple, made of worn leather, with a small silver charm in the shape of a butterfly. His heart skipped a beat. That bracelet, it had been Emma's. He had given it to her on her 21st birthday. He remembered how her eyes had lit up when she unwrapped it. "A butterfly for my little butterfly," he had said, watching as she slipped it onto her wrist and never took it off. Michael's hands trembled as he approached the counter. "That's an interesting bracelet you're wearing," he said, forcing a smile. "Where did you get it?" The woman glanced at her wrist, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Oh, this? I've had it for as long as I can remember. I don't even know where it came from. It was with me after an accident years ago." Michael's breath caught. "An accident?" She nodded, her gaze distant. "Yes, a car accident about 10 years ago. I don't remember much from before it. I guess I was lucky to survive." The room seemed to close in around Michael. His mind raced, piecing together fragments of hope and doubt. Could it be possible? Could this woman, standing just a few feet away, be his Emma? His voice trembled as he asked, "Do you remember anything about your life before the accident? Any names or places?" The woman hesitated, her eyes narrowing as if trying to pull memories from a fog. "Not much," she admitted. "Just flashes, faces I can't place, moments I can't explain. It's like trying to remember a dream." Michael swallowed hard, his heart pounding. He wasn't sure what to say next, but one thing was certain. He couldn't walk away without finding out the truth. Michael stood frozen, his mind racing as the young woman's words echoed in his ears. She didn't remember much of her life before the accident, an accident that happened a decade ago, the same year Emma disappeared. His instincts screamed that this couldn't be a coincidence, but he knew he had to tread carefully. If this truly was his daughter, she didn't recognize him. Pressing her too hard might scare her away. The woman, sensing his hesitation, tilted her head slightly. "Are you okay, sir?" "You look pale." Michael forced a smile, though his heart pounded in his chest. "I'm fine, thank you, just thinking about something." Her faint smile returned, and she busied herself tidying up the counter. Michael took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He needed more information, but he couldn't outright accuse her of being his daughter. That kind of confrontation could backfire. Instead, he decided to continue the conversation. "You said you've had that bracelet since the accident," he began, his voice calm. "Do you remember how you got it?" The woman shrugged, brushing a strand of dark blonde hair from her face. "Not really. The doctors said it was probably something I had with me at the time. I don't even remember where they found me. Just that I woke up in a hospital." Michael's stomach tightened. He imagined her alone in a hospital, with no memory of who she was or where she belonged. The thought made his chest ache with both sorrow and hope. If this was Emma, she had been out there all these years, living as a stranger to herself and to him. "Do you ever try to remember? I mean, about your life before?" he asked cautiously, hoping to learn more without arousing suspicion. She sighed, her expression thoughtful. "I used to, but it always felt like hitting a wall. The doctors told me not to push too hard, that memories might come back on their own if they're meant to. Sometimes I get flashes, faces, voices, places, but they're like puzzle pieces that don't fit together." Michael nodded, his throat tightening. He had no doubt that one of those faces was his. He glanced at her name tag, which read Ellie, and wondered if that was her real name or something she had chosen after the accident. "Well, Ellie," he said, testing the name. "I'm sorry for asking so many questions. I'm just fascinated by stories like yours. It's incredible how the mind works, isn't it?" Ellie smiled politely, though she seemed slightly wary. "It is. Anyway, if you need help with anything, let me know." Michael nodded, pretending to examine a pair of shoes. Though his mind was elsewhere, he needed to act, but he also needed time to think. Leaving the store without learning more felt unbearable, but he didn't want to overwhelm her. "Actually," he said after a moment, "I think I'll take these." He pointed to a pair of men's boots on the nearest shelf. It was a spur-of-the-moment decision, but he needed a reason to stay a little longer. Ellie rang up the purchase, her movements efficient yet unhurried. Michael noticed the small details, how she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating, the way her fingers lightly drummed the counter as she waited for the receipt to print. Each gesture brought another wave of familiarity. When she handed him the bag, their eyes met briefly, and Michael's breath caught. There was something in her gaze, a flicker of recognition that disappeared as quickly as it came. Did she feel it too? Or was it just his imagination, fueled by years of longing? "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie gave him a polite nod. "Have a good evening, sir." Michael left the store, the cool night air hitting him like a splash of water. He stood on the sidewalk, clutching the bag of boots, his mind spinning. He needed answers, but he couldn't get them alone. There was one person he could turn to, someone who had been there during the darkest days after Emma's disappearance, and who might be able to help him now, his brother, Richard. Michael pulled out his phone and dialed Richard's number. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Michael, everything okay?" Richard sounded concerned, as he always did when Michael called unexpectedly. "I think I found her," Michael said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I think I found Emma." There was a pause, followed by Richard's sharp intake of breath. "What? Are you sure? Where?" Michael glanced back at the shoe store, its warm light spilling onto the quiet street. "I'm not sure of anything yet, But she's working at a shoe store downtown. She looks just like her. And she has the bracelet, the one I gave Emma for her birthday. Richard's voice softened, though it still carried a note of skepticism. Michael, you've been through this before. People who remind you of her, coincidences that seem too strong to ignore. I don't want you to get hurt again. This is different, Michael insisted. I talked to her, Richard. She doesn't remember her past, but she mentioned a car accident, an accident that happened around the same time Emma disappeared. It can't be a coincidence. Richard sighed. Okay, let's not jump to conclusions. I'll come over tomorrow, and we'll figure out the next step together. Michael nodded, though Richard couldn't see him. Thank you. As he ended the call, Michael felt a renewed sense of purpose. If Ellie truly was Emma, he would do whatever it took to bring her back. The next morning, Michael sat by the window staring out at the quiet street as he waited for Richard. Sleep had been impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, Ellie's face appeared, those familiar green eyes, the way she moved, her voice. He was convinced now more than ever that she was Emma. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. What if she didn't want to know the truth? What if she didn't believe him? A knock at the door snapped him out of his thoughts. Michael opened it to find Richard standing there, looking as serious as ever. His younger brother was the practical one, always grounded, a trait Michael had leaned on in the years since Emma disappeared. You look terrible, Richard said, stepping inside and dropping his coat on the back of a chair. Have you eaten anything? Michael shook his head. I can't think about food right now. Richard sighed. All right, let's focus on what's important. Tell me everything. Michael recounted the encounter at the shoe store, every detail etched into his memory. Richard listened intently, his brow furrowing as Michael described the bracelet, Ellie's vague recollections of a car accident, and the way she moved and spoke. When Michael finished, Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. It does sound compelling, Richard admitted, though his tone was cautious. But we need proof. Have you considered asking for a DNA test? Michael hesitated. I thought about it, but how do I even bring that up? I can't just walk in there and demand one. She doesn't even know who I am. Richard nodded. True, but we need to confirm this before we go any further. If she's Emma, this could change everything, but if she's not... He trailed off, unwilling to finish the thought. Michael rubbed his temples, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on him. I can't let this slip away, Richard. I've waited 10 years. If there's even a chance... I know, Richard said, placing a hand on his brother's shoulder. We'll figure it out. For now, let's be smart about this. Do you know her schedule? When she works? Michael shook his head. No, but the store opens at 10. She might be there today. Richard stood. Then let's go. We'll keep it simple. I'll go in with you, and we'll observe. No confrontations, no big gestures. Just see what we can find out. Michael nodded, his heart pounding as they left the house. The drive to the shopping district felt like an eternity, though it was only a few miles away. When they arrived, Michael parked across the street from the shoe store, the warm light from the window as inviting as it had been the night before. There she is, Michael said, his voice barely above a whisper. Ellie was inside, helping a customer. She wore a light blue sweater that brought out the green in her eyes, her movements graceful and efficient as she gestured toward a display. Richard watched her for a moment before turning to Michael. She does look like Emma, he admitted, but looks can be deceiving. Michael's jaw tightened. That's why we're here. The two men entered the store, the bell above the door chiming softly. Ellie glanced up and smiled politely. Good morning. Let me know if you need help with anything. Michael's heart ached at the sound of her voice, so familiar yet distant. He pretended to browse while Richard approached the counter, striking up a casual conversation. These are some nice shoes, Richard said, gesturing to the display. Do you get a lot of customers looking for something specific? Ellie smiled. Sometimes. Mostly people come in not knowing what they want, and we help them figure it out. Richard nodded, keeping the conversation light. Sounds like you've been doing this for a while. Ellie shrugged. A few years. It's not what I thought I'd be doing, but it's nice. Quiet. Michael, listening from a few feet away, felt a pang of sadness. He remembered Emma's big dreams. She wanted to travel the world, work in publishing, and make a difference. The thought of her settling for a quiet, unremarkable life felt wrong, like a story cut short before its climax. Richard continued, his tone casual. Do you ever miss where you're from? Or do you prefer the peace and quiet here? Ellie hesitated, her gaze dropping for a moment. I don't really remember where I'm from, she said softly. After my accident, everything's been kind of blurry. Michael clenched his fists, resisting the urge to step in. Richard glanced at him, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Ellie. That must be tough. Do you ever get curious, want to piece things together? Ellie looked up, her green eyes thoughtful. Sometimes, but the past feels so far away. I've built a life here, and it's easier not to look back. Michael couldn't stay silent any longer. What if looking back could change everything? He asked, his voice trembling with emotion. Ellie looked at him, startled. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Michael saw something flicker in her expression, confusion, recognition, or maybe fear. Whatever it was gone in an instant. I should get back to work, she said quickly, stepping away. Michael felt his heart sink as she disappeared into the back of the store. Richard placed a hand on his arm. Not yet, he said firmly. We need more time. Michael nodded reluctantly, his resolve hardening. He wasn't giving up, not now, not ever. Michael couldn't stop replaying the brief encounter in his mind as he and Richard sat in a nearby cafe. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee filled the air, but he could barely taste the cup in front of him. His focus was entirely on Ellie, Emma. He was sure of it now. The way she had hesitated when he spoke, the flicker of emotion in her eyes. It couldn't all be a coincidence. Richard, seated across from him, stirred his coffee thoughtfully. She seemed rattled when you spoke, he said. You might have pushed too hard. Michael sighed, rubbing his temples. I couldn't help it, Richard. Seeing her, hearing her voice. It felt like all these years of searching weren't for nothing. But she doesn't remember me. How do I reach her without scaring her off? Richard leaned forward, his expression serious. You need to be patient, Michael. If she really is Emma, this isn't just about you. She's living a life she's built after losing her memories. If you come at her too strongly, you could make her run. Michael nodded reluctantly, though every fiber of his being screamed to act. So, what do we do? Richard took a sip of his coffee, his brow furrowed in thought. We need to establish trust. Go back to the store tomorrow. Keep things casual. Find a way to spend more time with her. If she starts to feel comfortable with you, she might open up on her own. Michael glanced out the window, the shoe store visible in the distance. And if she doesn't? Richard's gaze softened. Then we'll figure something else out. But let's take it one step at a time. That night, Michael couldn't sleep again. He sat in the living room, surrounded by photos of Emma. Her face stared back at him from every corner. The little girl who loved to climb trees, the teenager who aced every test, the young woman with a bright future ahead of her. The thought of losing her again after coming so close was unbearable. The next morning, Michael returned to the shoe store alone. This time, he came with a plan. He had brought one of Emma's favorite childhood books, tucked under his arm. It was a small gesture, but he hoped it might spark something. A memory, a connection, anything. Ellie was at the counter when he walked in, her expression unreadable. "Good morning," she said, her voice polite but distant. "Good morning," Michael replied, forcing a smile. He placed the book on the counter. "I thought you might like this. It's one of my favorite stories." Ellie glanced at the book, her brow furrowing. She picked it up, running her fingers over the cover. "I've seen this before," she murmured, almost to herself. Michael's heart raced. "Have you?" Ellie nodded slowly. "I don't know where, but it feels familiar." She looked up at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this? Why are you being so kind to me?" Michael hesitated, his throat tightening. He wanted to tell her the truth, but the words felt too heavy. Instead, he said, "Because sometimes people come into our lives for a reason, and I think you're someone worth knowing." Ellie's expression softened, though a hint of skepticism remained. "That's nice of you. Thank you." "Do you read much?" Michael asked, hoping to keep the conversation going. Ellie shrugged. "Not as much as I'd like. It's hard to find the time." Michael nodded. "I understand, but if you ever get the chance, this is a good one to start with. It's about finding hope in unexpected places." Ellie smiled faintly, tucking the book under the counter. "I'll give it a try." As the day went on, Michael stayed in the store, occasionally browsing but mostly observing Ellie as she worked. He noticed how she interacted with customers, her patience and kindness shining through. It reminded him so much of Emma that it was almost painful to watch. Every now and then she would glance at him, her expression curious but guarded. By the time the store closed, Michael felt a glimmer of hope. Ellie hadn't pushed him away, and she had accepted the book. It wasn't much, but it was a start. That evening he called Richard to update him. "She recognized the book," Michael said, his voice trembling with emotion. "She said it felt familiar." "That's a good sign," Richard replied, "but it's still not proof." "We need something concrete, Michael. Have you thought about getting her to talk about the accident? Maybe she remembers more than she thinks." Michael frowned. "I don't want to push her too hard. If she starts to suspect that I'm trying to dig into her past, she might shut me out." "Then take it slow," Richard said, "but keep going. You're closer than you've ever been." Michael hung up, staring at the phone in his hand. Closer than he'd ever been. The thought gave him strength, but it also terrified him. The closer he got, the more he had to lose. As he lay in bed that night, Michael clung to the memory of Ellie's voice, her touch, and the way she had looked at the book. If she really was Emma, he had to find a way to reach her. He had to bring her home. The following day, Michael returned to the shoe store, this time armed with another plan. He knew Ellie was starting to feel comfortable with his presence, but he needed to move carefully. The memory of her hesitant smile when she accepted the book replayed in his mind, giving him a fragile sense of hope. Today, he brought something even more personal, a small silver butterfly pin that had belonged to Emma as a child. The pin wasn't just any trinket, it was something Emma had cherished. She used to clip it onto her school backpack, and later onto her college satchel. Michael had kept it in a small box with her other belongings, unable to let go of the tangible pieces of her life. When he entered the store, Ellie was restocking shelves. She glanced up and gave him a polite nod, her guarded demeanor softening slightly when she saw him. "Back again," she said, a hint of humor in her voice. Michael smiled. "I hope I'm not overstaying my welcome." Ellie shrugged, brushing a strand of blonde hair out of her face. "You're fine. What brings you in today?" Michael reached into his pocket, pulling out the pin. "I thought you might like this. It reminded me of you." Ellie's eyes widened as she took the pin, her fingers brushing over the delicate wings. For a moment, her expression shifted, confusion, followed by something deeper, like a memory just out of reach. "This is beautiful," she said softly. "It feels familiar." Michael's breath caught. "Does it?" Ellie nodded, turning the pin over in her hands. "I don't know why, but it feels like I've seen it before. It's strange." Michael's chest tightened. He wanted so desperately to tell her everything, but he knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, he said, "Sometimes things have a way of finding us when we need them." Ellie looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his. "You're full of wisdom, aren't you?" Michael chuckled, though his heart was pounding. "Not really. Just a man who's lived long enough to know how life works." Ellie smiled faintly, tucking the pin into her pocket. "Thank you. It's kind of you." Michael stayed in the store for a while, pretending to browse while Ellie worked. He noticed how she occasionally reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the pin, as if seeking comfort from it. Every time she did, hope swelled in his chest. By the time the store closed, Michael had decided to take another small step forward. As Ellie locked up, he approached her. "Ellie," he said, his voice steady but soft. "Can I ask you something?" She turned to him, her expression cautious but open. "Sure. You mentioned you had an accident a while back. Do you ever think about where you were before that?" "Who you were?" Ellie hesitated, her gaze dropping to the sidewalk. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it's hard to think about. It's like trying to remember a dream that fades the moment you wake up." Michael nodded, his heart aching for her. "I can't imagine how hard that must be, but maybe there are ways to help you piece things together." Ellie looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why do you care so much? You don't even know me." Michael's throat tightened. This was the moment he had dreaded. How could he explain without overwhelming her? "Because," he said finally, "I know what it's like to lose someone, and I know how important it is to hold on to the pieces that make us who we are." Ellie studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "I'll think about it." Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. "That's all I can ask." That evening, Michael sat in his living room, staring at the butterfly pin's empty box. He could feel the walls closing in, the weight of the past pressing down on him. He had come so close to telling her the truth, but fear had held him back. What if she rejected him? What if she didn't want to remember? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone ringing. It was Richard. "How did it go?" Richard asked. Michael hesitated. "She took the pin. She said it felt familiar, but she doesn't know why." Richard was silent for a moment. "That's a good sign, Michael. It means something inside her is still connected to her past. You just have to be patient." "I'm trying," Michael said, his voice heavy. "But it's hard. Every time I look at her, I see Emma. I hear her voice, her laugh, and knowing she's right there, but not really there, it's unbearable." Richard's voice softened. "You're doing the right thing, Michael. You're giving her the chance to remember on her own, and that's what matters." Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure Richard could hear it. "Thank you." As he hung up, Michael felt a mix of hope and despair. He was closer to the truth than ever, but the journey ahead felt endless. Still, he couldn't give up. Not now. Not when he had come this far. In his heart, he knew one thing for certain. Emma was worth every step of the way. The following week, Michael continued his quiet visits to the shoe store, each time bringing something small yet meaningful. A book Emma once loved, a photo of a place they had visited together, or a snippet of a story they had shared. He didn't tell Ellie why these objects were significant to him, only that he thought she might like them. Her responses varied. Sometimes she would smile faintly, other times she would ask questions, curious but cautious. Each time, Michael noticed subtle changes in her demeanor. The way her fingers lingered on the butterfly pin in her pocket, the distant look in her eyes when she held the book he had given her. It was as if something inside her was stirring, fragments of a past she couldn't quite grasp. One morning, Ellie greeted him with a shy smile, surprising Michael with her openness. "You're becoming my most loyal customer," she teased lightly. Michael chuckled, his heart warming at the sound of her laughter. "What can I say? This place has good energy." Ellie tilted her head, her curiosity evident. "You're different from most people who come in here. I don't know, thoughtful. It's nice." Michael hesitated, caught off guard by her candidness. "Thank you. That means a lot." She glanced at the counter, where she had placed the latest book he had given her, a collection of Emily Dickinson's poetry. "I started reading this last night. It's beautiful, but it feels heavy, like it's trying to tell me something I don't understand." Michael's throat tightened. "Sometimes, the things we don't understand are the ones that matter most." Ellie nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I guess so." Their conversation was interrupted by a customer entering the store, and Ellie returned to her work. Michael lingered for a while longer, watching her from a distance before finally stepping outside into the crisp autumn air. He felt the familiar pull of longing and frustration, but also a flicker of hope. She was opening up, little by little. That evening, as Michael sat at home, his phone buzzed. He picked it up to see a text from Richard. Any updates? Michael hesitated before replying, "She's starting to open up, but it's slow. Slow is better than nothing. Stay the course." Michael stared at the screen, his brother's words echoing in his mind. Stay the course. He had waited 10 years to find Emma. A few more weeks or months of patience was nothing in comparison. The next day, he decided to take a more personal approach. He brought a small photo with him, carefully framed and wrapped in a simple brown paper bag. It was a picture of Emma on her 22nd birthday, standing in their backyard with a bright smile, the butterfly pin clipped to her sweater. When Michael walked into the store, Ellie was alone, organizing a display near the front. She looked up and smiled, visibly more at ease than she had been before. "Good morning, Michael," she said, her tone warm. "Good morning, Ellie," he replied, holding up the small package. "I brought you something." Ellie raised an eyebrow, curiosity sparking in her eyes. "Another gift? You're going to spoil me." Michael smiled, handing her the package. "I thought you might like this. It's special to me." Ellie unwrapped the paper carefully, revealing the photo inside. Her expression shifted the moment she saw it. Her eyes widened, and she held the frame closer, studying the image intently. "She looks familiar," Michael asked gently. Ellie nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "Yes, who is she?" Michael's heart raced, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Her name is Emma. She's someone I care about deeply." Ellie's gaze lingered on the photo, her fingers tracing the edge of the frame. "She has my hair," she murmured, "and her smile." Michael took a deep breath, his emotions threatening to overwhelm him. "She disappeared 10 years ago," he said quietly. "I've been looking for her ever since." Ellie looked up at him, her green eyes filled with something Michael couldn't quite name. Confusion, curiosity, and maybe even recognition. "You think I'm her, don't you?" Michael hesitated, his heart pounding. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think there's a chance. A small chance. And if there's even the slightest possibility, I have to know." Ellie set the photo down on the counter, her hands trembling. "I don't remember anything about my life before the accident. Everything is just blank. But when I look at this picture, I feel something. I don't know what it is, but it's there." Michael stepped closer, his voice soft but firm. "Ellie, if you're willing, there's a way to know for sure. A simple test. It won't change who you are now, but it might help you understand where you came from." Ellie looked at him, her expression torn. "What if I don't like what I find?" Michael's chest tightened. "Then we'll face it together." For a long moment, Ellie was silent, her gaze fixed on the photo. Finally, she nodded. "Okay, let's do it." Michael felt a wave of relief and gratitude wash over him. This was it, the moment he had been waiting for, the beginning of the end of a decade of uncertainty. He didn't know what the test would reveal, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't letting her go. The day of the DNA test arrived sooner than Michael expected. He and Ellie sat in a small clinic, the sterile smell of disinfectant lingering in the air. The room was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of paperwork or the distant murmur of voices in the hallway. Ellie sat beside him, her posture tense, her fingers fidgeting with the butterfly pin she had clipped to her sweater. Michael's heart ached as he watched her. He could see the fear in her eyes, the uncertainty that weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Ellie," he said softly, breaking the silence, "you don't have to do this if you're not ready." She looked up at him, her green eyes meeting his. "I am ready," she said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I need to know." Michael nodded, his throat tightening. "Whatever happens, I'm here for you. We'll figure it out together." The nurse called Ellie's name, and they both rose. Ellie hesitated for a moment before following the nurse into the back room. Michael remained in the waiting area, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. The minutes felt like hours, each second stretching endlessly as he replayed every moment of the past week in his mind. When Ellie returned, she looked pale but composed. "It's done," she said quietly, sitting down beside him. Michael reached out, placing a reassuring hand on hers. "Thank you for doing this," Ellie nodded, her gaze distant. "How long until we know?" "The nurse said it could take up to a week," Michael replied, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "It'll be the longest week of my life." Ellie managed a small smile. "Mine too." The drive back to the shoe store was quiet, the silence filled with unspoken thoughts. When they arrived, Ellie turned to Michael before stepping out of the car. "Thank you. For everything. I don't know if I would have done this without you." Michael's chest tightened at her words. "You don't have to thank me. I just want you to find the answers you're looking for." She nodded and got out, her figure disappearing into the store as Michael watched from the car. He sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel, before finally driving away. That week was indeed the longest of Michael's life. He tried to distract himself with chores, reading and long walks, but his mind always drifted back to Ellie. What would the test reveal? What would it mean for them both if she truly was Emma? And if she wasn't, could he bear to lose her again? Richard checked in regularly, his voice a steady source of support during Michael's sleepless nights. "No matter what happens," Richard said during one of their late-night calls, "you've given her something no one else has, a connection. Whether she's Emma or not, she won't forget that." Michael clung to those words, even as the days dragged on. Finally, the clinic called. The results were ready. When Michael and Ellie met at the clinic, her nervous energy was palpable. She shifted from foot to foot, her hands clenched at her sides. Michael wanted to say something to comfort her, but he didn't know what. All he could do was offer a reassuring smile as they were called into the office. The doctor greeted them warmly and handed Michael an envelope. "These are the results. I'll give you some privacy." As the doctor left the room, the air grew heavy with tension. Michael stared at the envelope in his hands, his heart pounding. "Ellie," he said softly, "are you ready?" She nodded, though her voice was barely audible. "I think so." Michael opened the envelope with trembling hands, unfolding the paper inside. His eyes scanned the text, searching for the answer that would change everything. When he found it, his breath caught. "It's a match," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Ellie, you're my daughter?" Ellie's eyes filled with tears as she stared at him, her expression a mix of shock, disbelief, and something deeper. Recognition. I don't know what to say," she murmured, her voice shaking. Michael reached for her hand, his own trembling. "You don't have to say anything. Just know that I've never stopped looking for you. Not for 1 second." Tears spilled down Ellie's cheeks as she looked at him, her walls finally crumbling. "I feel like I should remember everything, but I don't. It's like there's a part of me that knows, but it's just out of reach." Michael pulled her into a gentle embrace, his own tears falling freely. "It's okay. We have time. We'll figure it out together." For the first time in 10 years, Michael felt the weight of his grief begin to lift. Ellie, his Emma, was alive. She was here, in his arms, and he would do whatever it took to help her reclaim her life. As they left the clinic, Michael glanced at Ellie, her steps hesitant but determined. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, wiping her tears. "I think so. It's a lot to process, but I feel like I've found a piece of myself that I didn't even know was missing." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with pride and love. "You have no idea how much you mean to me." Ellie looked at him, her green eyes shining with newfound strength. "I think I'm starting to—" The drive back from the clinic was quiet, but the air between Michael and Ellie felt lighter than before. There was still so much to process, but the weight of uncertainty had been lifted. Ellie, the name she had chosen for herself, was Emma, his daughter, the missing piece of his life he had spent 10 years searching for. Michael glanced at her as she stared out the window, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the butterfly pin clipped to her sweater. "How are you feeling?" he asked gently. Ellie took a deep breath, her voice steady but soft. "Confused, I guess. Relieved, but also scared. It's like I have a whole other life I don't remember, and now it's staring me in the face." Michael nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening. "I can't imagine what this must feel like for you. But I want you to know, I'm here. No matter how long it takes, we'll figure this out together." Ellie turned to him, her green eyes meeting his. For the first time since they met, there was no hesitation in her gaze. "Thank you, Dad." The word hit Michael like a tidal wave. "Dad." It was the first time she had said it, and it brought a lump to his throat. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to focus on the road, but the tears welling in his eyes threatened to spill over. When they arrived at Michael's house, Ellie hesitated at the door. She had been living in a small apartment above the shoe store, her life built around routine and solitude. Stepping into Michael's home, with its walls adorned with photos of her younger self and remnants of their life together, felt overwhelming. Michael noticed her hesitation and gave her a reassuring smile. "Take your time," he said. "This is your home too, whenever you're ready." Ellie stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning the living room. The photos on the mantel caught her attention. A picture of her as a child, holding a soccer ball, another of her blowing out candles on her 16th birthday. She picked up one of the frames, her fingers brushing over the glass. "I don't remember this," she whispered. Michael moved closer, his voice warm and gentle. "You loved soccer back then. You were the fastest player on the team. And that birthday, we stayed up all night watching movies because you didn't want the day to end." Ellie smiled faintly, though her brow furrowed in concentration. "It's strange. Looking at these pictures, I feel like I should remember, but it's like trying to grab smoke. It's there, but I can't hold on to it." Michael placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to remember everything all at once. The memories will come when you're ready." Ellie nodded, setting the photo down. "Can I see my old room?" Michael hesitated, then gestured toward the hallway. "Of course." Ellie walked down the hall, her steps slow and deliberate. When she reached the door, she paused, her hand resting on the doorknob. Taking a deep breath, she pushed it open. The room was exactly as she had left it, a time capsule frozen in the past. The walls were painted a soft lavender, her favorite color, and the shelves were lined with books and trinkets from her childhood. Ellie stepped inside, her eyes wide as she took it all in. "It's like nothing's changed," she said softly. "I couldn't bring myself to touch it," Michael admitted, standing in the doorway. "It felt like if I kept it the same, you might come back." Ellie turned to him, tears brimming in her eyes. "You never gave up on me." "Not for a second," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion. Ellie sat on the edge of the bed, her fingers brushing the quilt her grandmother had made for her. "I don't know where to start, Dad. It's like I'm two people, Ellie and Emma, and I don't know how to bring them together." Michael sat beside her, his hand resting over hers. "You don't have to figure it all out today. Just take it one step at a time. You're not alone anymore." Ellie looked at him, her tears finally spilling over. "I don't know how to thank you for finding me." Michael shook his head, his own eyes misty. "You don't need to thank me. Having you here is all I ever wanted." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the past 10 years beginning to lift. For the first time in a decade, Michael felt whole, and Ellie felt like she had found the foundation she didn't even know she had been searching for. As the sun set outside, bathing the room in warm light, Ellie picked up a book from the shelf. It was her copy of The Secret Garden, its pages worn and familiar. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice filling the room with a sense of peace. Michael closed his eyes, listening to the sound of his daughter's voice. It was the sound of hope, of healing, of a future they would face together. Please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your friends.